Why are British bands so successful? This was a question I was asked by Fresh Prestified on my hashtag AskBrucey. If you guys have any questions, please do hit me up, Ask Brucey, or put them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer any questions on music technology, gear, and audio engineering. Thanks for the question. This is a multi-layered and multifaceted question to answer. I'm going to do my best at it. This is not a fully comprehensive thesis on the reasons, and I will probably jump around a little bit, but I do have an underlying theory about what contributed to a lot of bands, particularly in the 70s and 80s, becoming popular. I will, because this is a YouTube video and not a whole documentary series, make a few generalizations. Please do hit me up in the comments below if you want to discuss this further, because there are so many reasons and interacting factors which contributed to this, but I do believe there are one or two that we can look at to explore. So the first thing we need to discuss is the fact that we are talking about music or Western music from America and Britain over bands from maybe Europe or other countries in the world. It does seem, as most popular culture, that it is American and British focused, or at least it has been. That is changing as we see these days. You know, Latin American music is dominating streaming services, it is dominating record sales a lot of the time, so the balance has changed a little bit. But let's look back at what I think you are referring to as the kind of golden era of the music business before we got to this strange time where the music business is basically dying. Another thing we need to clarify is that it does seem that there were a lot of British bands that were very popular or timeless and seem to, you know, keep being mentioned and going on, but at the same time there are still quite a lot of American acts around that same time, the same era and the same global impact. But there was a period where, you know, quite a lot of British acts did do remarkably well. And the short version is, and I'm going to put this down to, is money and lack of money. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because there's two sides to the same coin, which I think gave British artists a bit more time to develop and hone their skills. So hold that thought for a moment. So if we go back in music history and look at where things were, you know, in the 1950s, you've got Bill Haley in the comments, the birth of rock and roll. You've got Elvis coming up. These are very American. These are totally American artists that are dominating records. In the UK at that time, you've got artists like Jerry and the Pacemakers who are, you know, kind of copying the Elvis rock and roll thing. You've also got people like Little Richard, again, a big bopper, creating the rock and roll vibe. So as rock and roll is continuing and becoming more popular, there's the music business is starting. People are tapping into the teenage market and they're seeing this massive opportunity to sell a lot of product, because at the end of the day, that all it comes down to. You know, we love music because it's music, but the music business is all about selling product. And in the US then, you've got this kind of diversion, newer form. So you've got soul, Motown and blues music all starting to bloom and blossom and create massive artists and massive music. So if you're looking at the early days, it's very American dominated, and as I said, we've got a few British acts coming on. One of those acts, obviously probably one of the most key acts, was the Beatles. So the Beatles are feeding on this rock and roll influence. Paul McCartney himself said he's a massive fan of Elvis, probably the biggest fan of Elvis and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis. So we're taking that influence, it's coming back over the water to the UK. The Beatles are a bit of an anomaly at that time. They're still doing their craft. They're over in Germany, in Hamburg, playing hundreds and hundreds of gigs, honing their skills before they're writing. And at the same time, the American scene is getting bigger and bigger. But what's happening in the UK around that time is slightly different. The UK was a much poorer country. We were coming out of the Second World War. I mean, it's still 20 years, but we were still paying for it. There were still bomb sites. It was still fresh in our memories. Where America, you know, whilst they were involved with the war, they did come in. They were not directly bombed, or they were not in it for the, you know, the longer period of time that the British were. There was this very different level of experience and life expectancy and requirements, because America was all about the American dream. And this is an important thing to remember when you consider what rock and roll was kind of doing. It was selling about cars and girls and being happy and all this early consumerist ideas. Whereas in the UK, we didn't really have that, or they didn't really have that. There wasn't much equipment. There wasn't much aspiration to live the American dream. The aspiration was to get out of perhaps poverty, or to just do something and to rebel a little bit against the war era and the fustiness of the British Empire. So there was a bit of rebellion going on. Add into that mix British sense of humour as well. I think this is a key thing as you go through British sense of humour, British cultural impact. These are very different mindsets to the, again, singing about girls, singing about cars, singing about aspiration. So a very introverted, inward-looking music, but as a result, there is a lot of freedom there, a freedom to be creative. And again, I think that was one of the reasons why British bands started to cross boundaries, because they weren't just singing about the same old things. Some of it was weird and wonderful. You know, some Led Zepp songs were kind of quite strange and out there. Cream and Eric Clapton, yeah, some of them were singing about girls, but a lot of the time it was about issues and fantasies, and perhaps maybe too many drugs were being taken. These are sweeping generalizations. There were, of course, American acts doing this, but we're talking about in the mainstream. What was also happening around that time was, of course, some acts like the Rolling Stones, for example, were flying over to the States and hearing blues music for the first time and stealing, there's no other way of stating it, from that. Led Zeppelin was stealing from that and bringing it back and turning it into their own thing. Because Britain, or at least musicians at that time, were very poor, there wasn't even that much equipment around. So that meant we had to be really creative with the things that we had. And I think that led to a lot of new styles, like obviously led to things like fuzz, with the Animals cutting their speakers to get a fuzz tone. You know, these were things that maybe were unthinkable in other places around the world, but they were just begging and borrowing and changing and messing around with things and being really, really creative. And I think there was a strong creative bubble that occurred, which again was interesting to people in the other markets around the world, because it was different. It was a bit out there, and it also, you know, had an element that, for some reason I don't fully understand this, but there is a perception of England around the world, probably because of all the novels and books and films that came out early on. There's a certain charm to it. Whether that's still true today, that's another debate for another time. But I believe there was a certain charm to it that perhaps was a little bit lacking in maybe the brash Americanness of the music that was put out there. So let's get down to the core issue of this about money. Now, the UK, love it or hate it, definitely has, or certainly really had, a three-tiered class system. And that's what I mean by money and lack of money. And if you look at a number of these really, really successful artists, they tend to come from one of two camps. They're either very, very working class, or they're quite middle class. You do see some from the upper class, but it's not the kind of thing that they're necessarily interested in. But middle class families will tend to support a child's aspirations if they're involved in music, and they don't have to worry. They don't have to worry too much, because they can do it and they can be supported by their families. And to me, this is probably one of the key issues of where I'm going with this explanation, particularly in the 1980s, is that the UK has a social security system in place where you can be, as what we refer to here, on the dole, unemployed, and get money from the government. Again, this is something that does not happen in America, or, you know, is very, very limited, where you could live off of the dole quite happily. Again, not a wonderful life, but you could certainly live. And if you look at so many artists, you will find both musicians and artists and filmmakers that they spent a lot of their early time on the dole. And because they were on the dole, and because they were not going to work, they didn't have to worry about money. They were able to be creative and work on their band and work on their music all of the time. So there is a strong argument to say that the dole and the social security that we had here actually repaid itself hundreds of times, because these artists, whilst they took from the system while they were developing, obviously as they became successful and then moved into the millionaire status, they then start paying higher rates of tax. So they're kind of paying back all of that money. So that's, to me, the key issue, and maybe hopefully answers some of your questions. Again, I've made some sweeping generalizations here, but I think to me that's one of the core reasons why there was so much success with British artists, because we nurtured them with the social security system unintentionally. I don't think it was, you could not sell that as a politician, you could not sell that as a government, but as an unintentional benefit of the dole system, we created this massive collection of musicians who were able to thrive. And as I said, on the other hand, those who had more money, we also created another series of musicians. And if you're thinking about people like Genesis being examples, most of them were very middle class, well off, went to private schools, public schools, and their parents supported their musical activities. They weren't having to rush out when they finished school or finished university to get a job. So there's this support and nurturing. And because of that, they're also able to fail. That's a big issue as well. You could keep trying and keep failing. Whereas if you're in a society which does not have that support network, there's no chance for that creativity to occur. There is also a focus that you've got to make it work because you need to get paid. You've got to sell your music. You've got to write what's wanted. You've just got to keep churning out what's wanted. And you can see that with a lot of the music coming out of America at that time. It was very, very similar, because this sells, this sells. It's a bit like what's happened to the film industry. It's like, we just need a sequel. We don't want originality. We don't want new ideas. We just want this thing. Formula works. Let's just keep hammer it until we find the next formula. Whereas over here in the UK, it's not like that anymore, but in those days, the 60s, 70s, 80s, it really was a case of you could do 2 or 3 albums. It didn't matter necessarily if they failed. You could be nurtured. Queen, went through a very interesting phase of nurture and then kind of going out of favour and then coming back into favour. But not all their stuff was great, or sorry if you're a massive Queen fan and you love everything, but you can see there's different changes. A lot of the bands I've mentioned, the Police, Duran Duran, Led Zeppelin, they tried things. The Beatles experimented with things. They tried different things. Some things worked, some things didn't necessarily work, or some things brought in different audiences. So they had multiple audiences, but they didn't really matter. Whereas now you've got this idea of a niche, and you just play to your niche and you sell to your niche. There's so much in this topic. There's so much music history, and there's so many other cultural factors to look at and societal factors. But to me, that's the small version is, I think British bands were perhaps more successful because they were supported through either family or through social security, which did not happen in other places in the world. I hope that kind of answers your question, Fresh Prestified. Love to hear your thoughts. We can debate this more and more. If you've got any more questions or any more thoughts, do put them in the comment below. Please do hit subscribe if you like my videos. And if you can, and if you are able, please do consider buying me a coffee. You can see the link below, because that helps me support and run this site. Most importantly though, take care of my friends, and I will catch you later.